St. Juan's home for the ADD.
Hello, this is Quan3217 bringing you episode number 13 of Kerbal Craft. Well, I said that we were going to launch these guys in daylight, but here at the Kerbal Space Program, we use meganewtons of thrust to make our own daylight. And so we decided that it was time to launch these tourists and get the funds, and they have fun, we get funds, everyone wins. And so we got a pretty normal sandstone launch going on here. Progressing towards burnout. We'll watch them through staging, make sure they don't do something stupid like blow up the lower liquid stage, as sandstone is known to do. Yeah, just like that. Okay, so, yeah, I think we are going to want to invest in Separatrons. And I think we might also want to invest in extra parachutes, because we got one, but we got about twice the load on this thing as we got on a usual one. So, well, it looks like our passengers are enjoying their trip. Our passenger and a crew, and our no pilots at all on board. It's another feature of this flight. And there we go, slowing down, hitting terminal velocity about 100 meters above the waves. And that's a little bit closer than we normally like to cut it at Quantum Astrodynamics. But any flight you can walk away from is a good flight, right, Bill? Well, looks like we owe these guys a rain check. And here we go, we're adding Separatrons, and man, do we really have to point them right at the core of the rocket like that? Like they're gonna burn right into our engine here. Or do we think we're some news program that's trying to burn up trucks with rocket engines tipped to the gas tanks? Yeah, we'll see how it works. If it burns a hole in it, or if it doesn't, whether it simulates it or not, what happens in Kerbal Space Program happens in real life. And since this is a test flight, we're going to leave our test engineer on board. We're not going to use any passengers on this one. Although I guess the last one was the first flight of that design too, and we let the passengers ride that. In any case, it's a test engineer because our test pilots are out playing hooky. Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Yeah, whatever. Come back soon, guys. And that is a clean separation. And since this is solely a test flight, and since we don't really have a pilot, we're going to cut the flight off right here and let this guy fly and fall back into the ocean without the extra risk of flying into orbit. And I have been promising dual parachutes for a while, so let there be dual parachutes. Do not go gently into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now we've got our two passengers on board a Sepatron-enabled, tested lower stage, and we are go for orbit. And welcome to space, guys. And as we say in the space business, no funds, no fund Rogers. So let's go get some more contracts. This looks like a pretty easy doable one, and we go capture another Kerbinaut. We can take on both of these. This one's just in low Kerbin orbit, so we can use Sandstone Zebra, and this one too. So let's go get them. So in our endeavor to acquire more Kerbinauts, it has proven more effective to expend 20,000 funds on a standstone to acquire new Kerbinauts than it makes sense to spend 70,000 to actually, pay them a salary and such. So that's what we're going to do here. We've had a Kerbinaut that's been up there for a while, and then this new one on this new contract, and we're just going to go pick them both up with this same rocket. 3, 2, 1, launch. We're using a new and improved sandstone Zebra here with the Separatrons and 20% fewer explosions in the first stage than the leading brand, which was an old sandstone. And I'll take this opportunity to plug my upcoming Rendezvous tutorial video. Rendezvous the NASA way. Watch this space, watch this channel. Check local listings for times and details. In the meantime, just watch this and see how the pros do it. And the first thing the pros do is do a zenith burn to keep from plunging back into the atmosphere. And in the meantime, back on the Sandstone Zebra R3, which has been christened by its passengers the Tourist Trap 1, we have examined the fine print on their contract, and it says that these people actually want to go all the way out to the moon. Orbit is just so last century. So we're going to take these guys all the way out to the moon here, which means that we're going to have a translunar injection. And in the meantime, the recovery of astronauts from low Kerbin orbit continues apace. Here we see Sandstone Rescue 3. We are going to use pretty much the NASA standard here. We're going to use the coelliptic rendezvous technique. And what we're going to do first here, and this is pretty much needed to be done on any rendezvous, the first thing is to make the planes match, because while you can do a rendezvous without the planes matching, as long as where you're going to intersect is also at the node, that just adds another constraint, and it adds more braking, and it adds more headaches. So the first thing we do is get the plane right. And you know when the plane is right, when the predicted node is 90 degrees away from where it is now. In fact, if you hit the plane node perfectly, then afterwards there wouldn't be a node anymore. The planes would be exactly coplanar, and node would be a meaningless concept. But nothing is ever perfect in space. And so what you do is you do the maneuver until the node is 90 degrees away, and that's how you know you are as close as possible in plane to the other object. And so that's what we're doing here. We're setting up our plane change. It's a relatively large maneuver here, so we're going to back off the thrust a little bit. Like I believe I've said in other videos, I like to have about a 10-second maneuver here. No matter how big the maneuver is, I like it to be about 10 seconds because that's short enough to not move too far in the orbit, and it's long enough to be controllable manually. And so that's what we have set up. And look at the time. I've actually talked long enough to get us all the way to the performance of this maneuver. So here we have our plane change, our NPC-1 maneuver for nth plane change number 1. Why don't they call it 1PC? I don't know. Ask the guys at NASA who designed this scheme. So now that we match planes, we're going to aim our nth change maneuver number 1, or NC1. They like to call it, during the Apollo program, they like to call it the coelliptic insertion. And that's because they went into an orbit that had the periaps at the same angle over the planet and the apoaps at the same angle over the planet as the target. And in both cases, the chaser and the target, they had a constant altitude difference between them. So for instance, if the target has a apoapse of 90 kilometers and a periapse of 85 kilometers, and you want to do orbit that's 10 kilometers lower, well then you go 80 and 75. And what you end up with this then in this case is that you have a constant altitude difference. And if the orbit's close enough to circular, like low Kerbal orbits tend to be, or like back in the Apollo program, like the lunar orbits tended to be, they were close enough to circular that you could perform a maneuver to get from one orbit to the other, and it would be pretty much the same size and same direction of maneuver no matter where in the orbit you performed it. You didn't specifically have to wait to apoapse or periapse or anything like that, because you were always going 10 kilometers up, and because the orbits were close to circular, it always took about the same amount of thrust. And so what we just did here is we performed this coelliptic maneuver, this NC1, and got our apoapse and our periapse close enough to the same distance below and close enough to the same angle. In fact, the closer the target orbit is to circular, the less it matters, the less the angle matters, because the apoapse and periapse aren't even well defined anymore if the orbit is very close to circular. And so now that we are in this coelliptic orbit, now we get to play the waiting game. Now, one thing that you'll notice here is that we are below the target, and that's the way that NASA always does their maneuvers, always does their docking, their rendezvous and docking, is that they have the chaser in a lower orbit than the target. And what this means is that the chaser will go faster and will gradually catch up, but the reason that they have it below is that if they were to launch the chaser into an orbit that was above, they would have to slow down, they would have to go backwards in order to get back into the target orbit. And the way the NASA guys think about it is that that's a big waste of fuel, because if you're going 17,000 miles an hour and then you got to back off 50 miles an hour, well, you've just wasted fuel. You've just wasted the fuel to get up to that speed and then wasted more fuel to get down from it. Whereas if you go into a lower orbit and you still need to go up, well then you can think of the fuel that you're using to go up as being part of the launch. And you don't have to think of it as being any wasted fuel. You use most of your fuel to do the boost, and then a little bit more fuel in the rendezvous in the same direction, pushing in the same direction in order to get into the target orbit. And then once you're in this coelliptic orbit, then you get to wait. You can line up when you want the rendezvous to happen. What you do is you plan anywhere you feel like in the orbit. You plan a certain amount of prograde, and enough prograde to get you from your chaser orbit up to the target orbit. And it'll be about the same wherever it is in the orbit. Now, once you have an intersect, you'll notice that in general, the target orbit and the target doesn't cross through the intersection at the same time as the chaser does. If you happen to be really lucky, then it is like that, and you've already picked the right time and you're ready to go. If not, first thing that you do is you switch the time of the maneuver plus and minus whole orbits until until the intersection, the target skips from being before the intersection to being after. And that means that you found the right orbit. And now you drag that maneuver node around the orbit until the target intersects at the same time as the chaser. And now you found the correct time to do the terminal phase initiation, which is what they like to call it. And it could be many, many orbits away. On the Apollo mission, when it was important to get a small maneuver time, because once they launched from the moon, they left all of their heavy oxygen tanks, they left the majority of their oxygen on the surface of the moon, and they only had these tiny itty bitty small oxygen tanks that would only last for a couple of hours or so. And so they had to launch at the right time when the command module was close to overhead, so that this chase phase was very short. It only took an orbit or so. On the other hand, when the space shuttle or when something is going up to the space station, they have to launch when the plane of the orbit of the space station passes directly over the launch site. And for instance, the space shuttle only had a 5-minute launch window. It had to launch within 5 minutes of the orbit of the station crossing over Cape Canaveral. And if they didn't launch at that time, then they didn't have enough oomph in their tanks to do a plane change and finish the rendezvous and finish the mission. And so they would launch when the plane was good, and that might mean that they were 3/4 of the way around the Earth, and that they had to wait for 2 or 3 days. It was pretty common to have 25 orbits of chase between the time that the space shuttle would launch and the time that it would arrive. One of the things that the Russians have worked out is that if they time their launch very carefully, they can get back to doing the 4-orbit rendezvous that the Americans were doing back in the 60s with the Gemini program. And those things aren't quite comparable, because during Gemini, whenever they launched, the target was always launched into an orbit which would be easy to reach from Cape Canaveral, whereas the space station is not in an orbit that's easy to reach really from anywhere. It's not easy to reach from Baikonur, and it's especially not easy to reach from Canaveral. And because of that, the plane change is the most important part, and you have to launch when you have to launch, and you have to chase for as long as you have to chase. And in this case, we have to chase for a long, long time. And one of the things that you've noticed is that our crew here has actually moved into the back seat, because there's only one exterior door on this spacecraft, and it's up in the capsule. And so we have to clear the capsule seat so that when we do match and we do acquire the new Kerbal, he will actually be able to get in the spacecraft. And this is the part where we say thank you to the author of the Kerbal alarm clock, because this allows us to have 4 other missions going on without losing track of anything. Valentina is about ready to get into orbit around the moon, and the terminal phase initiation for the rescue isn't going to happen for another 2 Kerbal days and 1 hour. So we will skip to Valentina and go have a look at her orbit insertion as she prepares to make history and become the first Kerbal to touch the surface of another world. And we're going to use the same IVA trick to get the very accurate maneuver. We planned this as a pure retrograde, but it is pure retrograde if it's an instant maneuver. So in the very middle of the maneuver, there's a time where the target will be exactly equal to retrograde. But during the rest of the maneuver, and you can see it starting now, during the rest of the maneuver, the target is always in the same direction, while the direction of retrograde changes as we go around the orbit. And so we point, and they did a very similar thing with Apollo. Rather than try and point at the retrograde vector or at the prograde vector, which is the easiest thing for an SAS in Kerbal to do, the easiest thing in the real life to do is to point at an arbitrary vector that's constant and not moving. So it's actually easier to point at a maneuver vector than it is to point at prograde or retrograde. And so what they do is they point it at the direction that they wanted, even though they would have rather have pointed in retrograde during the whole orbit, during the whole maneuver. And so we end up following our Apollo progenitors, our Apollo pioneers. And now Valentina is in orbit. And with that, we will call it a day. This has been Quan3217 saying, if at first you don't succeed, fly, fly again.